There's a problem brewing in Atlanta. There's too much parking. With over a fourth of downtown Atlanta being covered in surface parking lots, it's getting out of hand. But behind me is an even more pressing issue. We keep building more of it. What's the problem with all this parking? Well, it takes up a ton of space. It's space that could otherwise be used for things such as restaurants, retail, and most importantly, housing.
Let's walk around Midtown Atlanta, the booming urban district of new, modern apartment buildings. Let me introduce the parking podium. Hundreds of units, on top of hundreds of cars. You see it everywhere. Here, apartments over stores of cars. Here, more apartments on top of stores of cars. Here, condos over, you guessed it, more stores of cars. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's an epidemic.
So I find it interesting that the most expensive neighborhood in the city dedicates so much of its airspace to just cars. Sometimes hidden well, and sometimes hidden not very well at all. Rents are driving up like crazy, and all these cars might have something to do with it.
Atlanta wasn't always full of parking. Over the past century, our political leaders have reshaped the city for the automobile. Cars, cars, and more cars. Atlanta was jam-packed full of them by the 1950s. The solution? Minimum parking laws. These laws required business owners to provide X amount of parking based on factors such as business type, square footage, and occupancy.
What could go wrong? Surely these laws were well-researched, well-documented, and based on cold, hard facts. Well, unfortunately, it was pure bullshit. In almost all cases, parking requirements are created by political leaders and city council members who just flat out made up numbers parking. So walking around Atlanta, you really start to notice parking is everywhere.
You might think the answer is simple. Repeal minimum parking laws and problem solved. There's a nationwide movement pushing for such reform, which is super important first step. This removes the baked-in requirement for parking, which stalls small business, eats away at city financials, and just flat out looks ugly. But as much as activists might yell this in your face online, parking minimums aren't the silver bullet. For a long time now, Midtown Atlanta has had 0 parking minimums. So does downtown. Or actually any area in Atlanta within a 0.5-mile radius of a MARTA train station.
Yes, actually, Atlanta is very progressive in this manner. So why are we still seeing so much parking getting built? What I've realized is that the parking crisis is actually just a big factor in the overall housing affordability crisis. Let me explain.
The best thing we can do to keep housing prices down is actually quite simple. Build more housing. You might notice the sheer number of luxury apartments going up. This isn't just an Atlanta thing, it's happening in cities across North America. These developers almost always fill out the maximum parking requirement, or request even higher. But why, when they don't need to? In Atlanta, within the high-capacity transit district, the maximum parking values are currently at 1.25 spaces for a 1-bedroom unit, and 2 spaces for multi-bedroom units. Let's look at an example. 736 Peachtree Street is currently under construction in Midtown by Austin, Texas-based developer LV Collective. This development will have 29 stories and 374 units, ranging from 1 to 3 bedroom options. They are building 6 floors of parking, with 418 spaces guaranteed for residents. That's 20% of the building. Even with maximum parking requirements, we're still seeing developers basically build as much as possible.
But let's back up a minute. What's the issue with all this cheap parking in the first place? You can't be arguing that it isn't useful to have a car to go on a vacation, or see a friend, or maybe go get groceries.
According to the godfather of parking critique, Donald Shoup, all this parking works against the goals of modern urban planning. They increase urban development costs, burden enterprise, promote car dependency, and encourage urban sprawl. Really, all this car storage incentivizes people to drive. Cars have hundreds of negative externalities that impact public space, and in an age when we need to encourage public transit, walkability, and overall environmental consciousness, there really is a cost to all this cheap parking.
Across the board, if parking is provided, it's rolled right into the cost you pay. This is true at a Walmart, and this is also true at a luxury apartment complex. The developer's exporting this cost of parking to someone, and usually, it's the renter.
On average, including an above-ground parking structure, increases rental rates by around $200 in Atlanta, pretty close to the national average of $225. Now that's a lot of money, $2,400 a year, not including whatever carport fees you usually have to pay as well. But across the board, Atlanta is one of the cheaper cities to build parking in. Looking at 2022's parking construction rates, we see that Atlanta sits at $25,473 per stall. It's so easy for developers to choose parking over units. It's a relative bargain versus other cities. And this is for standardized parking designs, i.e. the Texas donut, or completely separated parking decks. Rents can get even higher once you start talking about custom parking podium designs like we see in Midtown, or especially underground parking. Underground parking has its benefits. It minimizes the negative effects of parking podiums by bringing residents and retail back down the street level. Oftentimes, underground projects contain less parking than their above-ground counterparts. But because providing parking is so economically viable here compared to other cities, developers still choose to build above ground, or a mixture of the options, to achieve goals of parking as an amenity.
This is all worsened by real estate values that are astronomically increasing. It's getting more and more expensive to build these days.
The reason we're seeing all this parking is a bit of a catch-22 situation. Really, it comes down to the banks. The banks need to make their money back on their investments, and in the red-hot housing market, they're only seeing those numbers on luxury-level rentals. Banks, therefore, only approve projects that include parking, luxury-level projects. At the luxury level, the construction of parking is less significant. They're simply able to make more money with less units, more parking, and higher rents.
Admittedly, I was a bit disappointed when I came to this conclusion. Now, I think Atlanta's poised to change the status quo quite easily. With projects like the Beltline coming along, and car-free living getting so much more popular, developers and banks are starting to see less parking as a feature, not a bug.
We've already done some of the most important steps, but it's not enough. Recently, legislation was recently rejected by Atlanta City Council to ban parking minimums within the Beltline Overlay District, the region surrounding the city that's home to high densities, lots of affordable housing, and future rail transit. Luckily, we've already reduced parking requirements on affordable housing developments, which is a great step in making these projects more viable. But we really need to think bigger, towards Atlanta City Council's eventual goal of no parking minimum citywide.
These buildings will stand for decades. It's setting a precedent that Atlanta's urban core dwellers will continue to drive for the foreseeable future. But we need to be more forward-thinking when it comes to thinking about urban environments.
There's actually a good example of forward thinking in Austin, Texas, that we need more of in our city. This developer is building a complex with a parking podium that can actually be converted easily to housing in the future.
The solution isn't no parking, it's just less. Reducing parking does numbers for both urban spaces and housing prices. We need to push our leaders to encourage more units for people and less units for cars. Thanks, y'all. See you next time.